This week, we turn our gaze to domestic violence. The recent killing of hip-hop musician Flabba has challenged our conventional notions about intimate violence, but also confirmed them to some extent. Here we have a female aggressor, unconventionally so, but one who's pleading self-defense. We don't know the facts on that case, but in today's debate, we want to unpack how domestic violence plays out in our social media-driven public space, where sides are often quickly taken and where debate can get quickly toxic. We also consider whether men and women today, including young men and women, are still shackled by the taboos of old, the myths of old when it comes to women's bodies and women's rights. To help us navigate these complex issues, we have a panel of guests today. Starting on my extreme right, we have Gugu Mhlungu, who is lifestyle editor and writer at City Press. She has spent nearly a decade in media, and she says she can't remember life before Beyonce, radio, and pork ribs. Next to her, we have Oguhle Maqaba. He's a writer and a photographer with an abiding interest in multimedia content, and he thinks social media is the future. So we'll quarrel a bit with this, given how hectic those social media streets can get. And next to him, we have Nova Masango. She describes herself as a brown girl wonder. We'll unpack that, a writer, poet, and a social commentator. She's also a member of the feminist Stokvel, a collective of Black South African feminists. You can read their full bios at www.enca.com. Erin Bates, as always, is our social media editor. Erin, you have a special message today.
I do, Trudy. We're hoping to really get the social media conversation going today. So to that end, we've put together a little video to provide our participants and viewers with a better idea of how exactly they can plug into the ENCA Live conversation. Let's take a look. Do you want to be part of the ENCA Live debate? Go to the ENCA Live debate page at enca.com. Go to ENCA News on Facebook, like us, and then RSVP to the ENCA Live event. Tweet me using the hashtag ENCA Live and our Twitter handle at ENCA Live. Be part of the ENCA Live community via Google Hangouts. Hashtag ENCA Live. Don't just watch the news, be part of it.
Domestic violence, intimate violence. The scourge is given many names, but it occurs within a particular social context. We'll start with women because that's the conventional terrain that we all know when it comes to this issue. Nova, you had an article in Vanguard magazine where you talked about your experiences just as a Black woman navigating what should be fairly sophisticated Johannesburg streets. But then you're subjected to harassment. So is there still a risk to stand out as a female? And in your case, as you put it, as one with ink, piercings, a vagina, black skin?
Definitely, I think so. And I think navigating urban streets for all women can be very treacherous, because it seems that men who are in those public spaces regard us as things that are their property. And so, you know, you get catcalled, you get groped, you always feel like you're in a little bit of danger when you're out there just doing what you need to do. And the really horrible thing is that, you know, there is no equivalent, you know, so it's very hard to get men to understand what street harassment is, because it's something that is enacted, it's a violence that is enacted upon women every single day, and it seems like it's really tough to get the message across to men, you know, to get them to stop, because they regard it as some kind of flirtation,
So there's an ownership that's felt that people can say whatever they like,
yes,
which might extend to intimate relationships too. What happens behind closed doors?
So.
Gugu, of course, you cover celebrity culture. In that world, women's bodies are quite a commodity. Are still a commodity. How does this play out, and why do we still have this narrative? Why don't we have a holistic picture of women, especially in celebrity culture?
I think part of the issue. It's not just celebrity culture, it's a broader culture that looks at the kind of, again, ownership or the feelings that you have a right to women's bodies. And I mean, one of the best definers of this idea is the idea of rape culture, where, you know, you've seen, I mean, recently there was a young woman called Pulane whose ex-boyfriend was alleged to have illegally released her naked images onto the internet. She came out and she was very, you know, she put on a brave face, and she gained huge masses of followings with people wanting to see her naked images again on Twitter. But really it's this idea that if you make it, people can then take it, they have access to it. And it's not just high profile cases. I mean, there was Jill Scott, there was Bulane, we've seen it before, but it also happens to, you know, people who aren't popular or famous. You take an image, be it naked or half naked or whatever, and the person you send it to, sometimes not even the person you send it to, think they then have a right to it. So I think it's a bit broader than just celebrity culture. It's this idea of, I have a right, I have a claim on this person's body and their images. And a lot of the time, I mean, the laws change slowly. A lot of the time it's actually illegal, it's a crime. It's actually a sex crime. And there isn't that understanding that it's actually a violation of someone's privacy. So even if I take pictures and send them to you, you as the intended recipient may not then, you know, publish them without my consent. And the key word is consent.
But I want to take you back to celebrity culture, because, you know, I think this is where a lot of people, our worldviews are framed, and also role models are being presented. And yet women in that space, their bodies are almost their capital and what they capitalize on. And if we look at Beyonce, we never really question her right to use her body and her sexuality. But where do we draw the boundary to say, well, you can use it only up to this extent, to the point where perhaps if you go beyond that, you're inviting negativity or scrutiny or even possession?
I think even that, so the idea that there are acceptable ways of using your body is also quite an arbitrary thing. So someone like Beyonce, I think it was a year ago, there was a video of her being pulled off stage. A man reached up for her because she gets quite close to, you know, the edge of the stage, and someone pulled her and then held onto her. And a lot of the commentary around that afterwards was, well, you know, she performs, you know, she's quite a sexual person. She puts on, you know, her outfits are very revealing and whatever. She's very proud of her sexuality. She loves her body, especially now that she's had a child. She thinks it's very important for women to be mothers and be sexual creatures as well. Not that those things are mutually exclusive, but there's this idea that then if you're going to be half naked or perform in a certain way, that then you must then accept what happens after that. And unfortunately, that line is actually, it's not real, it's non-existent. So it's this idea that if you then wear a certain length skirt, you must accept what happens next. But we've seen with incidences of violence that it actually doesn't matter. You have people being harassed and violated dressed inappropriately or revealingly, but also people being harassed in sweatpants or, like, you know, wearing a hijab. So the whole idea that there's a certain way, there's a line, is completely arbitrary. And the truth is, unfortunately, women have been led to believe that we can protect ourselves. So if I don't wear a short dress, or if I don't dance on stage, I will be safe. And that's actually not true.
So you can never really protect yourself by playing down your sexuality or even hiding or trying to, I suppose, fit into what respectability should look like. It's an interesting point. Oguhle, you're the gentleman on the panel. Boundaries and respect for women's bodies. Do you find that you're surrounded by a culture that doesn't quite define those boundaries or doesn't respect the boundaries?
Like when you look at, I'll speak for black males because that's what I'm used to, or people I'm used to. It's a matter of, we take it as it's in my culture to do this and do this and do that to women's bodies, and there's a lot of the time there's no education that is directed to men, to young men, that says now let's redefine what a man is and what you can and can't do, because a lot of the time the education is based on like, let's empower women, let's empower young girls, but how do we then let our young men not have an education of saying, okay, since we're in this day and age, this as a man, this is what you can and can't do. These are the things these are the boundaries that you work around. And at the end of the day, you empower the females. The men at the other end become frustrated to some degree and take out what those notions of what I am a man, I have ownership of this body, and then what they do is they enact it out on females. Not because women are dressed in a certain way or are in a certain way, but sometimes it's something that is inside. It's like my role as a man is almost non-existent now. So what happens is men start enacting an anger or frustration towards women because there's no reform towards men or education towards young men and men alike, saying, look at yourself and start redefining yourself and your role, so that there's a middle ground where we meet and say, okay, as a man, I can do this, I can't do that. And on the other side as well, women come and actually eventually join the conversation, so that everyone takes a piece of responsibility of what society gives out there. So I think that's just me.
I see a lot of nods around, Nova. Do you accept that premise that men need to be brought into the conversation and need to be educated around these boundaries? Are we making it our problem once again to then educate, explain?
You see, that's the problematic thing, you know. If we are the victims of abuse, to ask us to also be the ones who re-educate and help reform, I think is a long stretch. I think it's important that men start having these conversations amongst themselves, because women have been having these conversations, NGOs have been having these conversations. You know, every Women's Day, it comes out, 16 days of activism, it comes out. So I think it's time that men have their own spaces where they say, you know, we really do have a problem with how we define our manhood as a collective. We really need to reimagine and do better. And just on his point, I think that it's also problematic that when it comes to socializing men and their relation to
constantly want to play the role of a protector? Why do I constantly want to play a role of a person who's a disciplinarian? At the end of the day, men need to start internalizing these issues, internalizing for themselves, so that when they come out there, when they raise young boys, those boys can actually be raised with those questions in mind. So when they start interacting with women, they interact from a space of, this is who I am, not the notions of what a man is, not the concepts of what a man has been or has been dubbed to be. Because at the end of the day, times are changing. We're going on social media, we're going on this and that, but we constantly have to be redefining and defining what a man is for this day and age. We can't be living in the past and saying that's what a man was. We need to start saying now what a man is now, what is a man going to become, and how is that going to be enacted in society.
Okay, so a man for this season and for this era.
Yeah.
Erin, what are people saying on social media?
Well, when we put out some tweets and questions about this topic, we got responses specifically in relation to Flabba and specifically in relation to this idea of a male victim of what can be defined as domestic violence. The allegations of the murder and the circumstances under which it happened are obviously still to be discussed in the trial, which is in May. But we had a tweet earlier from a user whose Twitter handle is Lynn Kubu. She says the reason why it's difficult to tackle the Flabba case is because it's a joke that a man can be beaten by a woman. It's seen as a weakness, but it is happening. And that really, it touches on what you're saying, Okuhle, this idea of what a man is, what a protector is, you know, what the role of men in society is. Then we also had a response from someone called Chris Bacon on Facebook, and he's brought up the issue of rape and the number of rapes that are reported in South Africa. So he says, South Africa has over 50,000 reported rapes annually. He's highlighted reported, I suppose, to point out that a lot of rapes aren't. And And you might argue that in the case of male victims of rape, that the number of reports are even lower than they are with female victims, also very low numbers. Chris Bacon says again on Facebook, there is a culture of domestic violence in our country. Is it because we come from a patriarchal system?
Gugu.
I think the idea of men being victims of violence being a joke also is around, the ideas of manhood. Boys, at some point boys get taught to toughen up. Boys get taught not to cry. Boys are actually taught that they need to stay away from their sisters and mothers and become more like the other boys, be it a father figure, an older brother figure, a priest or whoever, in this attempt to create, the right kind of man that's tough and doesn't cry and is manly. But a lot of that manliness, and this is the other thing that's often disregarded, is boys are also victims of growing up in a patriarchal society, because then when you are a victim of violence, any kind of violence, in particular sexual violence, there is this huge kind of shame that you weren't man enough, that shouldn't have happened to you. I mean, there was the story of the boy in the Northwest who was sexually assaulted by his classmates, and his sexual assault was largely ignored initially. The fact that he was a black boy assaulted by 5 white classmates, that was the outrage. But here was this boy who'd been raped, and we were talking about it as sodomy. And we completely disregarded the sexual violence which had clearly occurred. And you even see it with responses to men being victims of abuse. The infamous video of Jay-Z being physically assaulted by Solange.
It was a joke.
Yeah. It was a joke, because why was Jay-Z, this big man, getting his ass kicked by Solange? But and a lot of people, and rightly so, pointed out that if the roles were reversed, it would be completely unacceptable. I think Ray Rice happened in the same year, and that and it wasn't treated with the same kind of outrage. Ray J was apparently beaten to a pulp by his girlfriend, and he became a laughing stock. So boys themselves also suffer as this idea of what a man should do, what a man should be, and as a result, the idea of men being victims is almost you completely diminish it. They disappear because it's not acceptable. There's no language for it.
But Ogushev, you laugh. What goes through your mind when you see a male victim?
And like she's just nailed it, because at the end of the day, I'm Zulu. I come from the KZN, and for me growing up, I like as a man, you cannot be less than a woman. You can't, regardless of her status or of anything, you cannot be less than a woman. And in society as a whole, again, as a man, you cannot be less than a woman. And that's what we grow up under. That's what we constantly told and constantly taught. A guy by...
but how is it taught? This is what I've often wondered, being a woman. I'd love to hear. What do the elder men say to you that nudges you in this direction?
No, the thing is, it's as a child, remember that a child sees and does. That's how you're taught. If your society, if everyone in society, even women in society, enact the fact that they themselves are less than a man, you will see it. If the men in themselves enact that, that's how you see it. And then what happens is, as you socialize yourself, even amongst a group of young men, that's how we all have seen the same images. We've all grown up around the same narrative, which is body language sometimes, which is, yes, language where you're sitting around your uncles and they tell you that, you have to have this amount of these girls to be a real man. And then you find yourself pursuing women for the rest of your life, wanting to reach a high number so that you can go back to your friends and say, hey, I've been with this amount of women, And it comes from when you were younger. What did you see? What did you hear? Who said what? And how even the women around you, how did they interact with those type of things? So that's how you're taught. Society, you switch on your TV, you see that on TV. Even today, you see that on TV.
So it's pervasive. It's almost in a sense that is the dominant narrative, and any movement away from this would have to be actually actively countered with counter messages. We're going to watch a quick clip right now, and then we'll continue the conversation after this clip. Do send us your messages, tweets, Facebook messages. See you just now. can we ever really know what happens behind closed doors? And can men become victims of gender-based violence?
Lisengibethwa nokubethwa ngasekhaya phambi kwabantwana
Bethwa ngubani?
unkosikazi.
A violent aspect of South African society that's rarely documented.
Uma uyindoda uyokhala emaphoyiseni ngonkosikazi wakho you look like a fool yazi. It's a joke, you become a joke uma ufika kiwe.
What is the state of affairs when it comes to how we respond to domestic violence, and how does it play itself out in popular culture and in the media?
Activist group Brothers for Life has decided it's time to hold men accountable, even drawing on painful personal experiences to get the message across.
From the moment I turned my life around, I saw a lot of growth in my family. I enjoyed a lot of contributions coming from a partner who I had over the years abused, over the years that had subjected to violence.
Now, this question of men as victims, I think it's obvious that at a basically, physical level, it happens that a man becomes a victim of violence meted out by a woman. But can it be gender-based violence? Is it domestic violence in the way that we think about it conventionally? Nova, are we using a title that's...
I think we can say that it is domestic violence because it happens in the location of the home and it happens as intimate partner, violence. But to call it gender-based violence, I think is incorrect, because to speak of gender-based violence is to speak of an entire system that informs the violence. It's to speak of an entire gender which is specifically being targeted, and being targeted from all aspects, the media, the way that governance is set up in the country, health issues, all those structures that enact upon this particular gender, which also enables the violence to occur. So I think when we speak of that, it's important to be clear about what we're speaking about, but I don't think that male victims, as important as it is, and as much as those individuals do matter, to try to put it also under the umbrella of what is happening to women in this country who are under siege every single day, I think that's too much.
Yeah, I had a conversation with Richard Delate earlier from Brothers for Life, and he was making the argument that for the majority of cases in domestic violence, it's a woman who's a victim, and therefore the cases of men have to be seen within a different context. But he also went, I suppose, slightly further to say that even when you do see men as victims, we have to probe what fuels it, because it might be that in that moment, it's the man who gets killed, but it happens within a relationship where there might have been psychological violence, the man might have had multiple partners, etc. So it becomes self-defense, ultimately. Oguhle, how do you respond to that?
It's true. Men are known as perpetrators of violence towards women's bodies. But the unfortunate part, again, when a man is either beaten up or dies from the hands of a woman, when someone says it was self-defense, it's possible. But at the end of the day, we don't know. We don't know the circumstances that actually pushed everyone to that point where the female started reacting. I've seen points where a guy tries to hit his girlfriend and the girl beats the guy up. And that there is self-defense. You can see it. But unfortunately, because society is the way it is, as soon as a man is a victim, we can quickly rush and say, hey, she might have been defending herself. Hey, this and this and this. But at the end of it all, we don't know. We were not there, and it's most probably is the case that he was trying to violate her or be violent towards her, and she defended herself. So that there for me is it's very tricky because.
And would you see psychological abuse in the same light, that eventually if a woman lashes out after years of psychological abuse in a violent way?
Funny enough, after the Flabba case, we spoke about, speaking amongst my friend, I put it like this, and this is basically my opinion, so that's just it. If I looked at it as in terms of athletics, a man's anger towards another man is like 100 meters. It's like it's a sprint. So they can 0 to 100, it's done. But a female can harbor anger through years, and they actually, that what I've seen, women can what's this?
Endure?
Endure, yes, they endure, but they do reach an end where they snap. And that's what, for me, that's what I've seen. And that's what I've heard even in conversations that I've had with guys. Because when I grew up, I was told by women around me that if ever you are stabbed by a woman, particularly as a man, it is highly likely that you will die because she's doing it out of a point of from such suppressed anger. No, that's what I grew up being told, that if you get stabbed by a woman, it's highly likely you'll die because she's coming from a place where it's so much anger that is bursting in that moment, that whatever she is doing at that precise moment is just. It's phenomenal, it's big, whatever.
Okay, it sounds a bit like mysticizing.
I know, but like that's and I'm saying this, and I've had conversations with guys that have heard the same thing. I'm not talking about guys from KZN. I'm talking about guys in general that have heard the same thing.
So when a woman's fed up,
when a woman's fed up, it's highly likely because when they react, it's one or two things. When they leave you, they leave you. If they enact and if there's an act of violence towards you, you're highly likely to be extremely damaged, if I may put it like that.
Okay, Erin, let's come back to you.
Okay, well, I mean, I think I have to respond just on that and say that one of the dangers is firstly that we're talking about very heteronormative relationships here. That's the first assumption we're making. And the other issue is that if you look at it in that way, you're also leaving out children. Boy children who are the victims of domestic violence. Those are very clear cases of male victims. But again, it's a very uncomfortable conversation. If it's sexual violence on the part of a mother or a father against that boy child, are we comfortable talking about it? Do we report on it? Can we actually tackle it, as a society? And the other issue is that, if it is a boy child, how does that kind of disrupt our comfort around boys being victims, boys being subject to physical dominance and physical sort of assault? But anyway, that's not what's on Twitter. So let me just get back into my corner where I belong. And reflect some of the responses we've had. So someone called Lincoln Josefson, whose Twitter handle is Lincoln Mokwena, has given us some great responses so far. One of which is, he says, society has created a system that cynically blames men for all domestic violence. Men are always seen as perpetrators and hardly as victims. That goes back to this issue of Flabba. How do we deal with it? How do we deal with it when we don't know the circumstances, when it's a soup potentially of dispute over cheating, over a relationship where, there may be infidelity? How do we deal with that? And then another one from Lincoln Mokwena is, he says, most violence against men has gone unreported. Even when reported, it turned against men. Comes back to what you were saying about the issue in the Northwest, where it was in fact rape, from what we understand, but it wasn't reflected as such. And it says society decides based on masculinity. So it is this idea of what is man, what is woman, where does power lie, how do we relate to one another's bodies, and kind of ownership. Yeah.
Interesting. I mean, I think it tells back to what we have been saying about men. And I think reminds us once again that if men can't be seen as victims, perhaps not of gender-based violence, but of violence, it kind of narrows the space and confirms once again the gender stereotypes. But I'd like to move on a bit from this subject and look at another myth that is often reflected in the way domestic violence is reported. And that has to do with women themselves, middle-class women, white women. It's often seen in this country as a poor black woman's problem. And I think the perverse effect is that when middle class or upper class women are victims, they're almost silenced by that idea. So, we've had everyone from Bonang, Riva, Rihanna, all of those women. When it happens to them, it's almost like one almost gets the feeling that we don't want to talk about it, or as middle class women, we feel this could never happen to us. Gugu, is that a sense?
Do you know, I think there are ideas of what makes a worthy victim or someone who is a believable victim. And I think there are certain groups for whom domestic violence or partner violence then becomes it's like it won't happen to you. For instance, queer individuals, when we discuss gender violence, are completely, in fact, almost completely ignored. The violence experienced in same-sex relationships, our stats are pretty low. The conversation when we talk about, when there's a campaign or a conversation about it, is largely ignored, especially, even less so, violence between two men who might be in a relationship. And then also the idea that if you're in certain spaces or occupy certain spaces, so you are married, the idea of marital rape, we've had to explain that actually you can't force sex on someone you are married to. And that's because of the whole idea that once you're in the confines of a marriage or even a long-term partnership, that suddenly you then become you're absolved, or it is impossible for you to be abused. So it's all of these ideas around, once you occupy a certain space, that you can't be a victim, or what happens to you in that space is not violence, it's not abuse, it's expected, or we explain it. The whole idea of forced sex, which really is rape, which happens in relationships. So I think, it's not just about different kinds of spaces women occupy, be it class or, be it where they live or what kind of relationship they're in. But there's definitely a kind of, you're a worthy victim, you're not, or you're a real victim, or that was really abuse or violence that you endured, depending on where you are.
Do I remember a few years ago, a friend of mine telling me that she'd been raped even years before that. And she said she didn't say anything because she thought she didn't want to be a victim. Does education and empowerment also undercut women in the sense that it makes them feel they're above this? They can't be seen in a place of weakness. Nova?
I think that's a big possibility because when you get to a certain level of your career or level of kind of financial comfort, it is said that, if you're able to transgress these boundaries in the boardroom, then, you can do anything. If you're sitting with male CEOs at your table, then you can really just surmount anything. And it hurts women because there are these abuses do happen, and it's not always a poor black man trying to drag you into the felt. That's not when it's abuse or rape. It can really happen with one of the highest earning men in the country. Like it's possible, and it comes in different guises, and it's important to open up the conversation so that people understand when it's happening as well.
Can I just say on that as well? It's not only possible; it happens. Those men rape.
Yes.
Wealthy white men who run big companies rape. Wealthy white men who have high status. Look at Bob Hewitt. It happens. But are we comfortable admitting that and talking about it? And especially when people are sort of collusive in those circles, if you're the wife, the sister, the colleague, is it something you're willing to actually put on the table and talk about? Or is it too awkward to actually address that? And I think the Bob Hewitt case is an example where that's actually come up, where people have had to say, this man had a lot of power and he leveraged his power and he assaulted underage girls and raped them. And he got away with it for a very long time.
To add to that, what happens in big companies where men want an exchange of sexual favors? Those are powerful men. If you want a raise or something and you're a female, you're coming to your boss, he wanting sexual favor. That in itself is a form of violating that woman's body. That says, because I'm in this position, I'm high up there, and also I'm talking about educated women as well. You walk into a meeting saying, I want this and I want that, and then what happens is the guy is like, okay, you get this, but can I have this?
But of
Can I
course,
have
the
that?
great lie is that you will get it.
Yes,
You know,
that's the great
that's
lie.
the
Yeah,
great,
that's the great
that's
lie.
the
Yeah.
great con, is to think that, oh, this is actually a fair exchange
Yes.
and it's going to work out if you play by those rules.
Yeah.
It's the same thing of thinking, oh, well, if I don't engage, I don't wear the short skirt, I don't wear the low-cut top, then I can protect myself. And that's the big lie.
I'd like to go back to what she said, that even in same-sex relations, I recently spoke to a friend of mine. He's a gay individual, and he said he was approaching someone to work with them, and what actually happened is the guy asked for a sexual favor in exchange. That in itself, because as she said, these things are not spoken about. Like, they're not out in the open, because we always look at men, women. We're not looking at the whole gender
And
spectrum.
it's about power,
Yeah,
perhaps,
it's
in general, those
it's about power.
relationships.
Yeah, those relations
that
about
can
power.
be exploited.
Yeah.
I want to go back to the idea of worthy victims, Gugu, as a journalist. Do you think journalists feed into this?
Absolutely. And often I think unintentionally. I think sometimes in the way we treat either women as victims or women as aggressors, we can often contribute to a stereotype or a myth unintentionally. So I mean, you know, a lot of the way in which you would have seen the reporting on, for instance, the Jay-Z and Solange issue, it wasn't tackled as you would have had it have been, you know, Jay-Z assaulting Solange. And a lot of that was done glibly. It was unintentional. It was like, oh, look, this happened. And I think a lot of the time, and that's why it's so important to also be conscious of this. A lot of the time you don't notice that you're doing exactly what you're trying not to do. So for instance, when media organizations also take part in the publishing of naked images, of women's images that have been illegally published and distributed, you're telling a story, but often it's, you know, what are you doing in doing that? You know, I do a lot of my work involves doing, like, looking at fashion, and it really is, and you know, part of the thing that really does well is like fashion police, where you say Erin looked terrible, Trudy looked great, Nova looked awful, what was she wearing? And a lot of what makes fashion police and that kind of thing work is the gendered language. And it really has been, it's a conscious effort. For instance, every time I have to do it, and I'm acutely aware of this thing, that, you know, when you talk about Ciara's dress, are you really talking about her dress, the actual dress itself? And would you talk about her dress in the same way that you would, you know, were she a man? So it's little things where, and a lot of the time it's stuff we've always done. It's seemingly, it's not meant with malice. It's not meant to be hurtful. But if you really look at it, literally things like fashion police, red carpets, a lot of that then becomes about women's bodies, the way women look in certain clothes, the way, you know, some women look good, some women don't. We go on about how women look post-pregnancy, which all seems very, it's not, I don't even think it's from a malicious place. But the truth is, it's incredibly malicious. It feeds into the system about how we think about women's bodies, what we can think we can say about women's bodies, and then, you know, as a result, what we think we can do to women's bodies. So I definitely think yes, and a lot of the time, which is the scary bit, it's not intentional, or we're not aware of what we might be doing.
I have to say on that as well, I saw a tweet before we began the ENCA live debate, and it was about Angelina Jolie having her ovaries removed because of concerns over cancer. And I thought about it, and I thought, have I ever seen a headline like this for a man who's concerned about prostate cancer, say, or, you know, cancer of the scrotum, or whatever it might be? And it just suddenly brought that back home again. I was like, this is such an intimate and private thing in a way, and yet it's you know, on my timeline for everybody to hear about, and how does that play back into it?
And feed into that negativity.
And it's so pervasive that when you work in media, you don't realize it, because you're like, oh, I just don't like her shoes. But it's like, well, what does that snowball into?
Why do you think you can comment on her shoes?
And why do her shoes matter and not what's in her head?
Or her acting, exactly. Now, all of this makes me think we need to go back to basics, as people like to say. So perhaps we need to look back to feminism, Oguhle. Shouldn't we go back to those basic feminist principles, teach our boys about feminism?
For me, I think I could call myself a humanist. But the point to that is that...
But where would humanism take us? Because we say we respect all people, but then we still have these gender issues.
The thing is, as humans, we have genders. It doesn't mean that if I'm a humanist, I start ignoring
But so why not feminist?
Let me just say this. I've got a son. He's 7 years old. And how I talk to him and how I teach him how to act towards anyone, first and foremost, is very important. But I also have to emphasize, because of what society is right now, I also have to emphasize constantly how he should treat women. Because at the end of the day, when he grows up, if I say, oh man, we're all human, let's be happy and rainbows and unicorns, that's not helping anything. If I'm saying, everyone, we're all human, let's treat each other as humans. However, because you see this and this and this and this in society, especially towards the female body, towards women, this is what you should not do. And I think that's where we need to start. We need to start at, first and foremost, teaching our kids how to view themselves as people, not as I'm a boy, I'm a girl. Yes, you are a boy, you're a girl. We all know that. However, now how do you interact as that boy and as that girl, knowing that that's another boy, that's another girl? How do you now interact with that? How do you interact with that person? And it's one on schools, it's on family, it's on parents to say, boy, she is a woman, and treat her in a certain way, because you do not own her. Because a lot of the time men believe somewhere deep inside that we own women.
Okay,
we own their bodies.
Somewhere deep inside Nova, is this not a case for feminism though? What he's just articulated.
I think it is, because the thing with humanism, it's such a broad kumbaya perspective. And I think that, we're living in a society that gives labels and names to things. We like to work with specifics. And so if you're going to be a non-racist feminist, then call yourself that, because each non-racialism and feminism, they each come with their own ethos and principles and education around certain things, and they tackle very specific problems. So as much as I think we're all humanists at the end of the day, but to say you're a feminist is to really be cognizant of the way that gender operates in society and to want to make it better and to educate yourself and those around you. I do believe that humanism is too broad a principle to adhere to, because it's like, okay, so what do the theories say? And what about humanism in a post-apartheid context in South Africa? How does that work? We've got Ubuntu. Has Ubuntu worked? Has Rainbow Nation worked?
But it's an open debate. So I'm going to let Oguhle respond, and then we've run out of time, so I'm going to ask Gugu to have the last word.
Okay, but that's why I'm saying, going back to that at the end of the day, the one thing that we all seek is to be seen as people and to be seen as equals in society. So if you raise your children to start seeing like that, and as I said, if you emphasize, because we know everything that goes on towards women's bodies that is perpetrated by men, and it can be inherited by kids, as I said earlier, looking at how society enacts these things. So you can teach a child to see everyone as human, but also you need to emphasize that at the end of it all, women have been at the back leg for so many years, and this is how you need to start treating them in relation to life.
Okay, I still have a cynical look on my face, so I'm going to let Gugu have the final word.
I think it is a combination of things. I think you need to acknowledge that we live in a particularly femicidal world. It is a real thing. The greatest danger to women in the world right now is men. Statistically, the stats prove it. And not just men they don't know, men they've never met, men they know, men they trust, men they love, which is the other complication, is that it's not, the stranger danger is out. I mean, when we were in primary school, we were taught about look out for strangers. But really, the incidence of violence happens with people you know in some way or people who know you. And that also adds a bit of, it makes it difficult. So there needs to be a recognition that women are particularly at risk. But I think also leaving the room or leaving, always being open to the idea that all humans can be potential aggressors. So I think, the difficulty with violence against men or men or same-sex relationships is then you aren't the right perpetrator. But the truth is all people can be perpetrators, and you can recognize that without then making it seem that, but that means women aren't in trouble. Yes, there are women aggressors. There are much fewer than male aggressors. And admitting that, though, doesn't mean, but there's no need for feminism, for instance, that women aren't in mortal danger every day. And we need to have those two conversations at the same time, recognize that there are particular groups at risk, but also you do have members of those groups who can also be aggressors.
Yes.
Thanks.
And just on that, I mean, it'll be the last tweet to throw in for today from the discussion online. But we have that from one of the participants, the viewers, who says anybody can be an abuser. Both women or men can be perpetrators and victims too. Tackling it has to be two-way, more education. And one of the education elements is to say that, yes, but what do the numbers say? And what is the probability of risk? And does one woman with a knife stabbing her partner in a debate about lovers' quarrels give everybody a get out of jail free card? I don't think so.
Yeah. This has been interesting. So I think we've got to a point where we say perhaps it's not about trying to find equivalence between female and male victims. It's not about trying to simplify the debate, but to say, how do we move forward? How do we see both sides of the coin when it comes to abuse? How do we start inculcating respect for women's bodies? Perhaps a call back to feminism. At the same time, we also have to be mindful of the fact that we have to take men with us on this journey. Thank you so much for watching ENCA Live today. Of course, the conversation goes on online on enca.com. And we'll see you next Tuesday at 1:30 for our next debate. Have a good week.